Picture this, a single bridge deck cracked open in the dead of night, and 1.5 million people on a peninsula suddenly realize their lifeline just got a lot thinner. To kill the body, you go for the jugular vein. Ukraine knows this approach well, and it has just delivered a devastating slice to the main artery that keeps occupied Crimea alive. The final phase of Ukraine's plan for the de-Russification of Crimea begins now, and it all comes down to a bridge. But it's not the bridge you're thinking about. If you're new here, welcome to Military Show. This is exactly the kind of deep dive analysis we do every single day, breaking down the weapons, the strategy, and the numbers behind the war in Ukraine. So before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what happened in the weeks after this strike is even bigger than the strike itself. So much attention gets paid to the Kerch Bridge, the 19-kilometer multi-billion-dollar showpiece that connects mainland Russia directly to Crimea. And rightly so. Russia poured at least $3.7 billion into that structure for a reason. It was supposed to be the key direct road and rail link that keeps Putin's military machine fed. But that giant bridge isn't the only one propping up the Russification of Crimea. There's another one. And for 2.5 years, it has arguably mattered just as much. Located near the village of Chonhar, this bridge connects the occupied southern regions of Ukraine to Crimea. It runs through Kherson Oblast as part of the Jankoy crossing, and it forms part of the major land route linking occupied Crimea to the portions of Ukraine currently under Russian control. In short, this bridge and the roads that feed into it are a logistics corridor moving troops, fuel, and ammunition between Kherson and Crimea. Even more than that, the Chonhar Bridge carries symbolic weight. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion in February 2022, it was this bridge that let Russian armor pour into southern Ukraine within days. It was a major reason Russia enjoyed so much early success in the south, and there has even been speculation that compromised elements inside Ukrainian intelligence allowed Russian forces to exploit that crossing before Kyiv could react. That speculation never produced arrests. But it does explain why a bridge so often overshadowed by its famous cousin at Kerch has for years quietly mattered just as much to Moscow's war effort. Ukraine just dragged that bridge back into the spotlight, and it did so with brutal efficiency. The news broke on June 7, 2026. An overnight drone operation carried out by Ukraine's military had targeted the Chonhar Bridge. The operation succeeded. According to the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine's first separate assault regiment, named after Dmytro Kotsiubailo, teamed up with the 475th Separate Assault Regiment's Code 9.2 drone unit for a joint strike that tore into the crossing. The goal was simple: sever the only major route Russia had left for shuttling personnel and supplies from occupied Crimea into the fighting around Huliaipol. The regiment's commander, who goes by the call sign Flint, explained that Russian forces on that front were sustained by a constant flow of logistics running straight through this one choke point, which is exactly why it became the target. The commander of the assault regiment, known by the call sign Perrin, added that the strike was aimed specifically at cutting fuel and lubricant supplies to Russia's 37th Motorized Rifle Brigade. What we see here is a Ukrainian strategy that has worked wonders throughout 2026. Shatter logistics in the rear to weaken Russia on the front. Oleksandr Nastenko of the Code 9.2 unit put it bluntly, telling reporters this was just the beginning and inviting everyone to grab some popcorn and watch what comes next. Bold words, but as you're about to see, they weren't empty ones. The Code 9.2 unit released footage of the strike, and the most striking moment comes when the camera cuts to the drone's eye view as it slams into the Kherson to Crimea jugular vein. We also catch glimpses of a command center, hinting at just how sophisticated this operation really was. The video's own description made the intent clear. This wasn't an isolated action, it was systematic work. And it's work that marked the combat debut of a brand new Ukrainian strike drone. But before we get to that, evidence of the damage didn't only come from Ukraine's own footage. It also came from Russia's own occupation authorities, and they were panicking. They now had to explain to Putin why a bridge critical to the Russian war effort had been hit, and why, once again, Russian air defenses failed to stop the attack. Volodymyr Saldo, the Kremlin's installed head of occupied Kherson, confirmed the damage himself, saying the bridge deck near the Chonhar settlement had been struck in an overnight drone attack, and that traffic through the Jankoy checkpoint had been suspended for security reasons, with vehicles rerouted through Armyansk and Perekop. Notice what's missing from that statement. There's no mention of drone debris, no claim that Russian air defenses intercepted the threat, and the damage was merely incidental. Saldo simply confirmed the hit. That's not the messaging Moscow usually wants. And the alternate checkpoints he mentioned aren't great options either. Perekop is a narrow route unsuited to heavy military convoys. Armyansk is more robust, but it too depends on a smaller bridge that Russia needs intact to keep functioning as an alternative. For now, Russia was left scrambling to reroute traffic away from a corridor connected to the R280 highway, a road Ukrainian drones had already been hammering for most of May, destroying dozens of vehicles along the way and effectively seizing partial aerial control over the route. This wasn't Ukraine's first crack at the Chonhar Bridge either. Back in August 2023, Ukrainian Su-24 jets fired Storm Shadow cruise missiles at the crossing, forcing a temporary closure before Russian crews patched it back together within about 9 days. That wasn't even the first time this exact stretch of road mattered strategically. Back in 2014, following Russia's annexation of Crimea, Ukraine's government quietly placed mines along the Ukrainian end of several bridges connecting the mainland to the peninsula, Chonhar included, as a contingency against a wider invasion. In April 2022, just weeks into the full-scale war, Ukraine's general staff confirmed that the Chonhar Bridge had indeed been mined at a moment when Ukrainian forces defending the area were badly outnumbered. There were later claims the bridge had been quietly demined to allow other operations, which the general staff denied at the time. The point is, this crossing has been a flashpoint for over a decade, long before most people watching this video had ever heard its name. This time was different. Every drone that hit its mark on June 7th was made entirely in Ukraine, and one of them was a weapon making its combat debut. That drone has the potential to be a genuine game changer. So what is it? The name alone tells you everything you need to know about why Ukraine's newest weapon is so dangerous. The Behemoth has landed. Multiple sources confirm Ukraine unleashed the Behemoth for the first time in this exact strike, flying alongside a wave of Firepoint-manufactured drones. The Behemoth is genuinely new. It was only unveiled to the public in May 2026 at the Wild Drones exhibition, developed jointly by the Ukrainian firms Culver Aerospace and GLEFA. Its specifications make it an intimidating addition to Ukraine's mid-range strike arsenal. With a wingspan of 2.28 meters and a combat radius of roughly 300 kilometers, the Behemoth is built around a tandem warhead, unlike almost anything else in Ukraine's current inventory. The nose houses a 40-kilogram high-explosive fragmentation charge. Behind it sits a second 35-kilogram thermobaric warhead, sometimes called a vacuum bomb. Combined, that's a 75-kilogram payload packed into a single airframe, a substantial figure for a drone in this weight class. Here's why that thermobaric second stage matters so much. When it detonates, an initial charge ruptures a container that scatters a fuel-air mixture as a fine cloud, one that seeps into cracks, crevices, and reinforced structures that a conventional blast can't reach. A secondary charge then ignites that cloud, creating a massive fireball and a shock wave that sucks up the surrounding oxygen. The result is devastating enough to gut reinforced buildings, cripple armored vehicles, or in this case, tear apart a vital bridge deck that Russia depends on to hold Crimea. The Behemoth isn't just powerful, it's versatile. It supports fully autonomous, semi-autonomous, and manual FPV control modes, communicates through Starlink, and cruises at 170 to 180 kilometers an hour with a top speed near 200. Crucially, it operates at an altitude of just 90 to 300 meters, low enough to slip beneath the coverage envelope of many Russian air defense radars. Launch preparation takes under 15 minutes, a serious advantage in fast-moving frontline operations. According to open-source estimates cited by Kyiv Post, each launch costs somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000, a fraction of the price of the infrastructure it's capable of destroying. Developers have also confirmed a longer-range Behemoth deep strike variant, though full specifications remain undisclosed. Now we can piece together exactly how Ukraine took down the Chonhar Bridge. Firepoint's FP-2 drones carrying payloads of up to 170 kilograms likely struck first, tearing open the initial damage and creating cracks across the roadway. That alone might not have been enough to finish the job, but it set the stage for the Behemoth's thermobaric follow-up, turning structural cracks into gaping holes and knocking the bridge out of commission. The Behemoth wasn't operating alone out there either. On the R280 highway itself, a separate new Ukrainian system has reportedly been wreaking havoc on Russian supply columns, a drone known by the call sign Morrigan, named after the war goddess of Irish mythology. Where the Behemoth specializes in ripping apart hardened infrastructure like bridge decks, reports suggest the Morrigan has been used to systematically hunt fuel trucks and logistics vehicles moving along that corridor, turning what Russian soldiers once called a safe supply road into what Ukrainian units have taken to calling the highway of death. Between the Behemoth tearing apart the bridges and the Morrigan picking off the trucks trying to use whatever routes remained, Russia found itself squeezed from both directions on the exact same stretch of territory. For Russia, the loss of the Chonhar Bridge was already a massive blow, and it turned out to be only the opening move. Quick reminder before we push forward, this is Military Show, and if you're finding value in this breakdown, the subscribe button and the notification bell are right there. We've got daily coverage of exactly this kind of story so you don't miss the next strike in this campaign. And there was a lot more campaign to come, because the Chonhar Bridge, as it turned out, didn't just get damaged on June 7th. Ukrainian forces returned. On June 9th, follow-up strikes partially destroyed the crossing outright, forcing Russian engineers to scramble. By June 11th, occupation authorities had thrown together a temporary pontoon bridge just to keep some traffic moving, a stopgap measure that speaks volumes about how badly the permanent structure had been wrecked and Ukraine wasn't finished, not even close. Over the following 2 weeks, Ukrainian forces expanded the campaign dramatically. In a single week in mid-June, at least 10 separate attacks hit 7 different bridges connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine in the north. The Henichesk Road Bridge, another critical crossing onto the Arabat Spit, was struck by FP-2 and Behemoth drones at least 3 times, with satellite imagery confirming direct hits that tore up its deck. Then, on June 18th and again on June 22nd, Ukrainian forces hit the road and rail bridges over the North Crimean Canal near Rozdolny, with the railway span's collapse confirmed on June 23rd by Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, who described the crossing as a strategic military logistical artery used to move Russian cargo and equipment from the mainland through Crimea and back into southern Ukraine. A separate strike even targeted Russian repair machinery sent in to fix the damage, because Ukraine wasn't just destroying the bridges, it was destroying Russia's ability to rebuild them quickly. Think about what that means cumulatively. In roughly 2 weeks, Ukraine didn't just cut one artery into Crimea, it systematically dismantled nearly every viable land route in the north, forcing Russian logistics further and further toward the increasingly fragile Kerch Bridge and a shrinking network of ferries, and the ripple effects hit exactly where Ukraine wanted them to: fuel. By late May, motorists in Sevastopol were already limited to 20 liters of fuel per vehicle per week, purchased through prepaid coupons that vanished within minutes of release. By mid-June, the situation had deteriorated into what the Washington Times described as the worst fuel crisis on the peninsula since Russia's 2014 annexation. Nearly 80% of hotel bookings in Crimea were reportedly canceled in late May and early June, according to Russian business daily Kommersant, as tourists either couldn't get in or couldn't get fuel once they arrived. Some hotels started offering complimentary gasoline just to lock in bookings. On June 21st, Crimean authorities suspended civilian fuel sales entirely, restricting purchases to government and security agencies only. Sevastopol went even further, halting all fuel sales to civilians outright for 2 straight days, reserving what little remained for emergency vehicles. Speculators began reselling gasoline at double the market price. Then, on June 26th, Russian-installed Crimean Governor Sergei Aksyonov formally declared a state of emergency across the entire peninsula and in Sevastopol, granting occupation authorities sweeping powers to restrict movement, shut down businesses, and carry out forced evacuations if needed. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was forced to publicly acknowledge the fuel shortages, promising vaguely that measures were being taken. For a regime that has spent over a decade insisting Crimea is thriving under Russian control, that's a remarkable admission. Even the Kerch Bridge, the crown jewel Russia spent billions building, isn't the safe corridor it once was. Vehicles crossing it have long been restricted from carrying large volumes of fuel out of fear that a struck tanker could take out sections of the bridge itself, a lesson Russia learned the hard way starting in October 2022 when a truck bomb detonated on the span, killed 5 people, and collapsed 2 sections of the roadway, forcing months of repairs before it could carry heavy traffic again. Ukraine returned to the bridge again in 2023 and once more in 2025, each time forcing fresh restrictions and reminding Moscow that its flagship crossing was never as untouchable as the propaganda suggested. As the fuel crisis worsened in June 2026, authorities briefly raised the personal fuel carrying limit for vehicles crossing the bridge from 100 to 200 liters, a small concession that only underscores how desperate the supply situation had become. Ferries that had been quietly picking up the slack were themselves targeted. On June 21st alone, Ukrainian strikes reportedly destroyed 3 ferries involved in transporting fuel tankers across the Kerch Strait, along with storage tanks that continued burning for days afterward. All of this feeds into a program Ukraine's Ministry of Defense formally launched in late May 2026. Logistics Lockdown. Roughly $113 million was funneled into expanding the drone units responsible for these mid-range strikes, building on more than 1,000 geolocated attacks already carried out against Russian logistics targets that year. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, didn't mince words about the intent, telling the YouTube channel Pressing that logistics were being systematically cut off and that Crimea could soon effectively become an island with consequences for Russia that even Moscow might not anticipate. Robert Brovdy, the head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, had predicted the isolation of Crimea just a week before the logistics lockdown program delivered exactly that result. And it wasn't only bridges and fuel trucks in the crosshairs. On the same day as the Chonhar strike, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces hit the Semikolodzyanska oil depot and a maritime fuel terminal in Feodosia, striking directly at fuel already sitting on the peninsula. Weeks later, strikes on the Kerch Seaport Oil Depot and the TES Terminal Storage and Transshipment Complex kept those fires burning, while a thermal power plant fire in Kerch triggered rolling blackouts across multiple Crimean cities, some reduced to just a few hours of electricity a day. Russian-appointed officials tried blaming the outages on vague technical faults in the grid, a claim that grew harder to sustain with every new strike. Ukraine even struck a historic Sevastopol landmark, a 19th-century panoramic painting depicting the Crimean War's defense of the city, destroying it in a fire, a symbolic wound that one Russian military blogger admitted would be especially painful for Putin personally, given how much the Kremlin has invested in Crimea's historical mythology. Analysts at the Moscow Times point out that nationally, Russia's fuel shortages remain manageable for now, with most ordinary Russians barely affected, but the picture is starkly different in the war-adjacent zone that includes Crimea and the frontline regions, where the shortages are almost entirely a product of Ukrainian strikes on trucks, storage facilities, and transport infrastructure rather than any broader production collapse. That distinction matters. This isn't a nationwide economic crisis for Russia. It's a targeted, engineered isolation of one specific, strategically vital peninsula, and it's working exactly as designed. So where does that leave the Kerch Bridge, the last major artery still standing? For now, it remains largely untouched by precision strikes, still functioning as the single consistently reliable link between Crimea and mainland Russia. But that's not because Ukraine has ruled it out. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has openly published strike maps showing the Kerch Bridge well within range of its drone campaign. Blasts have already been reported near the Kerch ferry crossing, with residents describing smoke and the smell of burning in the area. President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed strikes on facilities on both sides of the Crimean Bridge in late June, hitting maritime fuel logistics in Russia's Krasnodar region on one side and an oil depot in occupied Kerch on the other, squeezing the bridge's supporting infrastructure from both directions without yet striking the span itself. Analysts increasingly describe a strike on the bridge as less a matter of if than a matter of timing and accumulated resources. Step back and look at the full shape of this campaign, because it is genuinely one of the more elegant pieces of strategic pressure we've seen in this war. First, Ukraine isolates. Then, it destroys. Attacks on the R-280 highway and its feeder routes crippled the vehicles Russia needed to move personnel and supplies. Strikes on the Chonhar, Henichesk, and Rozdolny bridges then severed the roads and rails those vehicles depended on. Strikes on oil depots, ferries, and fuel terminals inside Crimea itself finished the job, draining whatever reserves the peninsula had left. Layer by layer, Ukraine turned what was supposed to be Russia's secure southern staging ground into a peninsula under siege, without a single Ukrainian soldier setting foot on it. This is a sharp departure from the failed 2023 counteroffensive, when Ukraine tried to physically punch through Russian lines toward the Sea of Azov and pay the price in blood for every kilometer. The 2026 approach doesn't require occupying territory at all. It relies on cheap, Ukrainian-built mid-range drones like the Behemoth and the FP series, hitting deep behind the front line where Russian defenses are thinnest and the payoff is largest. It's asymmetric warfare in its purest form, a drone costing tens of thousands of dollars taking a multi-billion-dollar logistics network apart piece by piece. Do the math for a second because the numbers here are genuinely staggering. Russia spent an estimated $3.7 billion building the Kerch Bridge alone, not counting the billions more poured into roads, rail lines, checkpoints, and air defense coverage across occupied Crimea over the past decade. A single Behemoth launch, by comparison, costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000 to $50,000. Even accounting for the drones that get shot down or miss their mark, the cost asymmetry is almost absurd. Russia is being forced to defend billions of dollars of fixed infrastructure against a weapon that costs less than a decent used car, and it's losing that exchange badly. That's the core logic behind Ukraine's entire mid-range strike doctrine in 2026. You don't need to outspend Russia's war machine. You just need to make every ruble Russia spends on defending Crimea buy less and less protection over time. It also helps explain why Russian military bloggers have grown increasingly vocal about the gaps in Crimea's air defense umbrella. Some have openly called for deploying automated anti-aircraft turret systems and distributing hundreds of additional man-portable air defense teams around population centers, along with cheap interceptor drones designed specifically to hunt down exactly the kind of low-flying threats the Behemoth represents. The fact that these calls are happening publicly on channels sympathetic to the Kremlin tells you just how exposed Russian commanders privately believe Crimea has become. For the 1.5 million people living under Russian occupation in Crimea, the consequences are immediate and personal. Fuel lines stretching for blocks, rationed gasoline, hotel cancellations gutting the tourism economy the Kremlin has spent over a decade promoting, blackouts on a rolling schedule, a state of emergency that hands local authorities the power to restrict movement and force evacuations. This is what strategic isolation looks like when it actually works. For Putin, the dilemma is brutal and it isn't going away. Defending Crimea more heavily means pulling air defense systems and troops away from the front lines and from Russian territory that's already under strain from long-range strikes. Failing to reinforce it leaves the peninsula exposed to exactly the kind of layered campaign that just tore apart its bridges, drained its fuel supply, and forced its governor to declare a state of emergency. Neither option is good, and every additional Behemoth drone that rolls off the production line only tightens that vice further. There's also an industrial dimension here that shouldn't be overlooked. Culver Aerospace, the company behind the Behemoth, isn't operating in isolation. It signed a cooperation agreement with the German defense firm Helsing back in April 2026 to jointly develop and manufacture drones at a facility inside Germany itself, a project financed by the German government. It also struck a 5-year agreement with a Danish partner earlier in the year. That means the Behemoth production line isn't just a Ukrainian wartime workshop anymore. It's becoming part of a broader European industrial base, which means the supply of these drones is likely to grow, not shrink, as the months go on. For Russia, that's a genuinely frightening trend line. A weapon that already proved capable of severing Crimea's land bridges within weeks of its unveiling is now backed by manufacturing capacity outside Ukraine's borders, insulated from the kind of strikes Russia has used to target Ukrainian defense production in the past. Russia will keep repairing what it can. Pontoon bridges will go up. Alternative checkpoints will absorb what traffic they can handle. But repairs take time that Russia doesn't have in abundance, and every fix becomes a fresh target the moment it's operational. The Chonhar Bridge was the jugular vein. Ukraine sliced it open in June 2026, and in the weeks since, it hasn't stopped cutting. The Behemoth has landed, and if the pattern of the last month is any indication, occupied Crimea's isolation is only going to deepen from here. That's the story of how one bridge strike turned into a full-scale campaign to cut Crimea off from the rest of occupied Ukraine, and quite possibly, eventually, from Russia itself. If you want to understand where this war is actually being decided right now, it isn't only on the front lines around Pokrovsk or Kupiansk. It's on obscure 2-lane bridges most people have never heard of, and in the fuel lines stretching outside Crimean gas stations. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what's happening in southern Ukraine, do us a favor and hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment with what you want us to cover next. We put out daily analysis just like this one, and Military Show is only able to keep digging into stories like the logistics lockdown campaign because viewers like you keep coming back. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.